Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Drum Talk, and with us today is SeamlessR. He's a producer. He is a sound creator. He does all kinds of synthesis, and one of the most interesting things I found about Seamless is that he actually can synthesize his own drum sounds. And thanks for joining us, first of all, on this Drum Talk today.
No problem at all. I'm happy to be here.
And you guys can check out Seamless's stuff on YouTube. He's got a lot of kind of audio production education stuff on YouTube. Just search SeamlessR. So let's talk about drum synthesis because I find this really fascinating. You know, kind of in our world, the way we would create a drum sound is we would either go out into a room and mic something, or we would take some samples and blend them and combine them together. But I've noticed, you know, you with your Creative Live, you kind of dive into how you create like a kick sound and all these different ways of doing that. Can you tell us a little bit more about sort of your approach to drum production from a synthesis standpoint?
Sure thing. So the most basic kind of like kick synthesis is pretty straightforward. You basically take a sine wave and you just pitch it down really fast from high to low, and then you got yourself a kick. And a lot of the oldest kind of drum synthesis is based on that idea. And that's actually, that concept is still true for the other kinds of instruments that you associate with a kit. Like the toms and snares have that same sort of process involved in it. And if you look at a recording of like a real kick and a real snare and real toms, you see that it's actually in there, and like the motion of the harmonics in the spectral analysis. So one day I decided to see if I could like copy the harmonic profile of a sound with synthetic elements and make it sound like a real one. And what I did is I took Superior Drummer and just took like the default Metal Foundry kick and just kind of looked at it. And I saw all the various motions of it, and I basically just tried really hard to mimic that motion as well as I could with what I wanted to use, which in this case was FM synthesis. That's pretty much all there is to that.
That's awesome.
That's really sick.
Yeah, so do you find yourself, I mean, I'm sure you find yourself doing all kinds of stuff then from there, you know, tuning the sine waves to different notes, and do you like, you know, add other types of audio processing on that, like such as distortion or pixelation or, you know, that kind of stuff?
A lot of that. It's actually a big part of doing snare synthesis. Kicks, not so much. Kicks are a very simplistic kind of thing. You just kind of make a high frequency click sound, and it's usually fine. Sometimes you can get real into like physical modeling and try and get like a room sound out of some kind of like reverb element. But snares, especially like modern electronic snares for like the harder hitting like bass music genres, there's a lot of distortion that's involved in getting the tone that people associate with it. And so like on every element of it, like even on the roomy kind of sound reverb, because people will do that just on a regular snare sample. They'll take out an acoustic snare sample and distort the whole thing, so all of those elements end up being distorted. And the reason why I like synthesizing stuff myself is because I'm in control of every individual element. And if I can separate all of those elements to being like the fundamental tone, that's the snare, the sine wave that comes down, the kind of clappy mid-rangey sound, the papery high frequency sound, and then like the metallic kind of ringing sound, which is pretty easy to do with FM. And like I can distort or not distort or reverb every individual element to mix it, and then ultimately compress it all together, and I have just most control over it than, you know, people usually do.
So with that much control, you know, comes a lot of responsibility in order to actually be progressive and move forward, right? You got all these options. What about analysis paralysis? How do you avoid that?
Well, handling that is basically, I just spend most of my time referencing things. Like I have a target that I'm trying to hit with a particular sound or a particular kind of synthesis, and most of everything that I'm doing is going to be to service that particular goal. And then like if I'm actually being fully creative, that I definitely do have that problem of like I have every option ever, and it's just my responsibility to get it where I, you know, like it. Versus if I just have a reference or a target, then I just, you know, try really hard to make that be what I'm doing. And whether or not I succeed, it still serves to sort of focus the effort.
Gotcha. So let's jump in a little bit to mixing, because having a lot of control over the synthesis of the sound gives you a lot of control over the final sound of it when you're building a drum from scratch, right? You can, you know, fabricate the click, fabricate the note, fabricate the low end, the sustain, everything. At that point, what do you need mixing tools for? What do you find yourself using on that kind of stuff?
Well, I still kind of look at drums in like a kit format. Like even on like really hard hitting electronic stuff, it's still everything is still around the idea of the kit. The kick, the snare, hats, toms, cymbals, that kind of thing. So inter-kit mixing is easily handled by the fact that I have control over every individual element of a hit. But then like the rest of the song, it's actually I treat it like you would normal stuff. Like I use a lot of ducking via side chaining, a lot of the regular kind of EQing and scooping and that kind of thing, targeted side chaining of EQ nodes and whatever. It's pretty basic stuff, but like it's a lot like I try to treat it as much like a real drum at that point as I can. And it's not because I don't want the kind of control, because you can think that like, okay, if you have control of all the individual elements, then you can really push the envelope of which parts are interacting with what, and you could do that, but what happens is that it sounds too clean. It sounds too like unlike what people are used to hearing when they think of what a drum is supposed to be. So it's almost like I have to limit myself to make it worse in a particular kind of way to have it sound right.
Do you find yourself using anything else to make it more punchy or more aggressive in the mixing process, or do you kind of just get that exact sound when you make those samples and you don't have to tweak from there?
In a perfect world, by the time it's done and it actually is a sample, it's as punchy and as sharp and as hard as it needs to be. But usually I use a lot of multi-band compression, and I'm particularly a fan of Image Lion's Maximus for this purpose, because it approaches compression in a way that no other compressor does, although you can still use it like a regular compressor, which is important from what I said before, where for a lot of things we have to kind of like fake reality by introducing limitations. But when I'm not doing that, then Maximus is good because it allows you to use basically wave shaping principles, but with a compressor. So I can do all the kind of compression I need to do. I can do transient shaping. I can do the kind of clipping that makes the really transient hits stay transient, and then everything else is just regular mixing after that for mixing with the actual song.
So one of the topics we've been talking about here on Drum Talk is sort of this drum clipping revolution, which might be kind of new to some people. For us, we've been doing it for the last few years, just to kind of have that aggressive drum sound, the competitive drum sound, especially in the metal genre. And I know that we recently showed you DF Clip. So what can you say to someone who doesn't know much about clipping or wants to get into drum clipping to kind of take that next step towards that aggressive drum sound?
I've always looked at clipping, like when I first started using it, which was kind of by accident, I looked at it as being free compression. And by free, I mean that you don't have the sort of typical costs associated when you compress something or over-compress something. And that all comes down to the time variables in a compressor, your release, your attack, ahead, and that kind of thing. When you're using that and you're trying really hard not to distort something, what happens is that you lose your impact because it smooths it out too much. But clipping, like distortion and compression are the same process. So clipping is just the same thing, but without the time variables. It happens instantaneously, and it shapes the waveform because it reacts faster than the oscillation of the waveform. That means that like even if you are cutting it and like you're limiting like your transient from being a perfectly sharp thing to being something that's more square, it's happening instantaneously, so you still preserve your impact. And it also helps it to be a hell of a lot louder than you can get with just regular compression, because the resulting signal spends way more time at the limit than it would if it were compressing at, like, to try not to distort it.
That's great. Appreciate your time, and thank you for coming on the show. And if people want to find you on YouTube or something like that, where can they find you?
Pretty much everything about me online is /SeamlessR, and the YouTube channel is full of over 1,000 videos on everything I've ever thought to know. So if you want to learn more about this stuff, there's definitely videos there, and on everything else I can think of.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
No problem at all.